In 1847, a ship docked in Liverpool carrying Irish passengers who had paid everything they owned for the crossing. Most of them arrived sick. Many did not arrive at all. The Atlantic had claimed them mid-passage, and their bodies had been dropped into the ocean somewhere between a country that could no longer feed them and a world that had not yet decided what to do with them. The people who survived walked off the gangways into a city that did not want them, wearing clothes that had not been washed in weeks, carrying nothing. What had driven them across that ocean, what had destroyed the lives they left behind, was the failure of a single crop. Not a war, not a government collapse, not a plague, a plant. A small, dirt-covered, poisonous root vegetable that European civilization had spent 2 centuries refusing to take seriously. And that refusal, that 200-year window of contempt, is exactly why, when the potato finally failed, the consequences were so catastrophic. Because by 1847, millions of people had staked everything on it, not because they chose to, because there was nothing else. This is the story of how a toxic weed clinging to the rock faces of the Andes became the 4th most important crop on the planet. How it fed the explosive population growth of an entire continent, then destroyed part of it. How it was rejected, feared, banned, and blamed for leprosy, and then became the crop NASA has designated as the most likely candidate for feeding the first human colony on Mars. Not bad for something that started as poison. The Andes Mountains, 8,000 years ago. High above the cloud line in what is now southern Peru and Bolivia, at altitudes above 12,000 feet, wild potato plants grew in the rocky, wind-swept soil between the cliffs. They were small, some no larger than a walnut. They were also genuinely dangerous. Wild potatoes produce glycoalkaloid compounds, solanine and tomatine, that cause nausea, vomiting, convulsions, and in sufficient quantities, death. The indigenous peoples living in these mountains had not been reading about this in journals. They had learned it the hard way, through generations of experiment and accident, in a landscape that offered very few alternatives and even fewer second chances. But they had also figured something out that would alter the course of human agriculture for the next 8 millennia. If you soaked wild tubers in cold mountain streams for days, letting running water leach out the toxic compounds, and then exposed the partially detoxified potatoes to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing at high altitude, where nighttime temperatures routinely dropped below 0, you could break down enough of the remaining harmful alkaloids to make the tuber safe to eat. It was a multi-day process. It required patience, accumulated knowledge, and an intuitive understanding of chemistry that these ancient farmers never would have described in those terms, but were practicing rigorously anyway. And over thousands of years of selecting the least bitter plants and replanting only the mildest specimens, Andean farmers did something that the word breeding barely captures. They redesigned a wild organism. They pulled the poison out and the starch in, generation by generation, until what remained bore almost no resemblance to what they had started with. They did not know the word genetics. They were doing it anyway. By the time the Inca Empire rose to dominance across Western South America in the early 1400s, the potato had become something extraordinary. Inca farmers working the terraced fields carved into the steep mountain slopes around Cusco and throughout the highland provinces cultivated more than 3,000 distinct potato varieties. Some were bright yellow, some deep purple, some red, white or blue, so dark they looked almost black. They came in shapes ranging from smooth and round to gnarled and twisted in ways that would alarm a modern grocery shopper. Each variety was calibrated to a specific altitude, a specific soil composition, a specific microclimate. The Inca did not simply grow potatoes, they had built an entire agricultural science around them. And through that science they had built a civilization. The storage problem that would stump European farmers for centuries, fresh potatoes rot, and in a world without refrigeration that is a serious logistical crisis, had already been solved. The technique was called chuño, and its simplicity was its brilliance. Freshly harvested potatoes were spread across flat ground at high altitude and left to freeze solid overnight in the Andean cold. The following morning, as the equatorial sun warmed the mountainside, families would walk across the frozen tubers barefoot, pressing out the moisture with their own weight. They repeated this cycle, freeze, press, for several days until what remained was a light, chalky, bone-dry block that weighed almost nothing. Chunyo could be stored for 5 years, for 8 years, for 10 years or more without spoiling. It was arguably the first processed food in human history. It fed Inca armies on campaigns across 3,000 miles of mountains and coastline. It sustained cities through years when the rains did not come and the harvest fell short. The Inca measured time partly by how long it took to cook a pot of potatoes, and they measured distance partly by how much chunyo a traveller needed to carry between 2 points. This was not a staple crop. It was the operational infrastructure of an empire. Then the Spanish arrived and proceeded to completely miss the point. When conquistadors entered South America in the 1530s, they were looking for gold and silver. They found both in extraordinary quantities. What they did not find, or rather what they found and immediately dismissed, was the ugly tuber that the people they were conquering ate at nearly every meal. Spanish soldiers and administrators did bring potatoes back to the Iberian Peninsula around 1570, but no one was excited. There were no proclamations, no royal endorsements, no agricultural campaigns. Potatoes were handed to sailors on long voyages as cheap provisions to prevent scurvy. They were donated to hospitals and monasteries as food for the sick and the poor. The Spanish crown, busy cataloguing Inca gold, had no interest in promoting a crop that came from people they considered beneath civilization. This seemed like a small decision at the time. It was not. When the potato reached the rest of Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the reaction ranged from suspicion to outright horror. And to understand why, you have to understand what Europe already believed about food. European civilization had organized itself around grain: wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Noble crops, crops that grew above the soil in the sunlight, that produced the bread considered a gift from God. Entire feudal economies, entire legal frameworks, entire systems of taxation and tithe were built around grain cultivation. Bread was not merely food. It was a category of morality. The potato grew underground, in the dark, in the dirt. It was misshapen, lumpy, covered in strange little protrusions that people called eyes. And, perhaps most damning, it belonged to the same botanical family as deadly nightshade, one of the most poisonous plants in Europe. To deeply religious, superstitious societies already primed to read the natural world as moral communication from the divine, this was not a botanical coincidence. It was a warning. The rumours spread faster than the crop ever could. The Parliament of Besançon in France formally banned potato cultivation in 1596 on the grounds that the plant caused leprosy. The Russian Orthodox Church called the potato the devil's apple and declared that eating it was a sin. Parts of Germany and Switzerland circulated accounts attributing potato consumption to flatulence, moral corruption, and scrofula, a tuberculosis-related condition that caused grotesque swelling in the neck. Scottish Presbyterian clergymen refused to allow potatoes in the diet of their congregations on the theological grounds that the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible, and therefore the crop could not have been intended by God for human consumption. This was a real argument, delivered by real men, in real churches. For nearly 200 years after arriving in Europe, the potato sat in gardens as a botanical curiosity. Wealthy families grew it as an ornamental plant. Its purple and white flowers were considered genuinely attractive, and Marie Antoinette reportedly wore potato blossoms at French court events, which says everything about the gap between how the potato was perceived and what it was actually capable of. Potatoes were, in the eyes of European civilization, animal feed at best and a mark of desperate poverty at worst. Even the poorest English labourers considered it an insult to be offered potatoes instead of bread. For a while, the potato seemed stuck in this position, a rejected, misunderstood crop rotting in the margins of European agriculture, while millions of people around it went hungry. That did not last. War has a way of clarifying nutritional philosophy. The first major turning point came in Prussia, where Frederick II, Frederick the Great, faced a specific military problem. His country kept getting pulled into devastating conflicts with neighbouring powers, and during those conflicts, enemy armies would burn Prussian wheat fields. Grain was easy to destroy. You set fire to it. Done. But a crop that grew underground, completely hidden beneath the soil, an invading army could march directly across a potato field without ever knowing that dinner was 6 inches below their boots. Frederick saw the strategic potential immediately. In 1756, he issued the Kartoffelbefehl, the potato order, commanding Prussian peasants to plant potatoes or face physical punishment. Predictably, the peasants were not enthusiastic. According to one widely repeated account, villagers in the town of Kolberg sent the king a message informing him that potatoes had neither smell nor taste and that not even dogs would eat them. Frederick, apparently, decided to try a different approach. He planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and posted uniformed soldiers around its perimeter to guard it. The implication was wordless but obvious. If the king himself needed armed sentries to protect these plants, they must be extraordinarily valuable. Prussian peasants began sneaking into the royal garden at night to steal seed potatoes for themselves, which, the story goes, was exactly what Frederick had intended. Whether every detail of that legend holds under historical scrutiny is debated. The result is not. Within a single generation, the potato had become a major staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Across the border in France, a pharmacist named Antoine Augustin Parmentier was conducting a remarkably similar experiment through entirely different means. Parmentier had served in the French army during the 7 Years' War, been captured by Prussian forces, and spent 3 years in captivity being fed, day after day, almost nothing but potatoes. He came out of that imprisonment in good health. Better health, frankly, than many soldiers who had eaten the standard French military diet. This observation struck him as important. He spent the next several decades of his life on a singular mission, convincing the French people to eat potatoes. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society where every course, from the first through the dessert, was made from potatoes. He presented potato blossoms to King Louis XVI, who wore one in his buttonhole. He convinced Marie Antoinette to wear them in her hair. And then he planted a large potato field in the sandy, infertile soil outside Paris, posted armed guards during daylight hours, and pulled the guards away every night so that curious Parisians would come steal the plants. Parmentier was running a one-man public relations campaign for a root vegetable, decades before the concept of public relations existed. It worked. By the late 18th century, France had finally begun accepting the potato as human food. Parmentier's name is still on the Paris map, on a metro station, a boulevard, a hospital. The dish hatchie's Parmentier, France's version of shepherd's pie, carries his name in every restaurant in the country. He devoted his life to a lumpy underground tuber, and France gave him back to history. But while France and Prussia were slowly warming to the potato through royal endorsements and strategic theft, something very different was happening across the English Channel, something that would demonstrate, in the most brutal way imaginable, exactly what happens when a civilization stakes everything on a single crop. Ireland in the 18th century was under British rule, and the vast majority of Irish land was owned by English and Anglo-Irish landlords who frequently never visited the estates they controlled. Irish Catholic peasants, the overwhelming majority of the population, were tenant farmers on tiny plots they did not own and could be evicted from at any time. British penal laws had systematically restricted what Irish Catholics could inherit, what they could purchase, what professions they could enter. Families were pushed onto smaller and smaller plots. Many survived on less than an acre of rocky, boggy, marginal ground. And the potato was, for this situation, almost perfectly designed. 1 acre of potatoes could produce enough food to feed a family of 6 for an entire year. No other crop came close. The potato grew in poor soil where grain would fail. It thrived in the cool, wet Irish climate that made wheat and barley unreliable. It required almost no investment to plant or harvest, no plough, no horse, no mill. A spade, some seed potatoes, and enough rain, which Ireland never lacked. A family could survive on potatoes and buttermilk and almost nothing else, and the nutritional balance of that diet was actually more complete than it sounds. Potatoes provided carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, and potassium. Add buttermilk for calcium and fat, and you had a diet that could sustain life, generation after generation. Ireland's population grew from roughly 3 million in 1700 to over 8 million by 1840. The potato made that growth possible. But there was a catastrophic flaw built into this dependency, visible to anyone who understood agriculture, invisible to anyone who depended on it. Nearly all of Ireland's potatoes came from a single variety, the Irish lumper. Farmers across the country did not grow multiple types. They grew one. This meant that every potato field in every county was genetically identical to every other potato field. If a disease could kill one Irish lumper plant, it could kill every Irish lumper plant simultaneously. There was no resistant variety waiting in reserve. No genetic diversity to fall back on. The entire food supply of a nation rested on one genetic line of one crop. The clock was ticking. Ireland simply could not hear it. In the late summer of 1845, a cargo ship docked at a European port carrying potatoes from the Americas. Hidden in those potatoes were microscopic spores of Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrived in precisely the cool, wet conditions that defined the Irish climate. The blight crossed Belgium and the Netherlands first, destroying crops as it moved, then England, then Ireland. The effect was instantaneous. Potato plants that looked perfectly healthy in the morning were black, wilted, and rotting by evening. Farmers walked into their fields to find that entire acres of green, thriving crops had collapsed overnight into stinking blackened mush. When they dug up the tubers hoping to salvage something, they found that the potatoes themselves had already turned to foul-smelling pulp beneath the soil. In parts of Western Ireland, in Mayo, Galway, Clare, the stench of decay grew so overwhelming that people tied cloths over their faces just to breathe outside. And then the blight came back. It returned in 1846, worse. Again in 1847, again in 1848. Year after year, the potatoes rotted in the ground, and families who had no other source of food began dying. In their homes, on roadsides, in ditches beside fields that had nothing left to give. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, diseases that move through malnourished populations like fire through dry grass, swept across the west of Ireland. Entire villages were depopulated. Workhouses built to hold hundreds held thousands. Mass graves filled behind them. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died of starvation and the diseases that followed it. Another million emigrated, many on ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden they became known as coffin ships. Passengers died by the dozens during Atlantic crossings, and their bodies were dropped into the ocean. Ireland's population fell by 25% in less than a decade. Even today, nearly 180 years later, Ireland's population has not recovered to the level it held before the famine. The British government's response made everything worse. While Irish families starved, Ireland continued exporting grain, butter, and livestock to England under armed military escort. Relief programs were slow, underfunded, and attached to degrading conditions. Men had to perform hard labor, building roads that led nowhere, in exchange for wages too small to buy the food that was becoming unaffordable. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official overseeing famine relief, described the crisis in official government correspondence as the judgment of God on a morally inferior people, and argued that providing too much aid would create dependency. He wrote that, officially, the famine was not simply a natural disaster, it was a natural disaster made catastrophically worse by what the political class chose not to do. Here is the strange thing, though. The famine did not destroy the potato. If anything, it proved beyond any doubt how indispensable the crop had become. The lesson the world took from Ireland was not that potatoes were too dangerous to grow, it was that you should never stake everything on a single genetic variety. Grow more types. Breed for resistance. Diversify. Plant breeders across Europe and the Americas began developing new varieties resistant to Phytophthora infestans. Agricultural scientists established seed potato programs to ensure genetic diversity. The disaster that nearly destroyed Ireland became the catalyst for a new era of scientific potato farming. You have to sit with that for a moment. The worst agricultural catastrophe in European history did not end the potato's story. It accelerated it. Russia had been fighting its own potato battles simultaneously. Catherine the Great had tried promoting potato cultivation in the 1760s, distributing seeds to provincial governors across the empire. Russian peasants resisted, violently, in some cases. The forced planting campaigns of the 1840s triggered what historians call the potato riots, where entire villages rose up against government officials, burning fields and attacking the bureaucrats who had ordered them planted. Despite the resistance, the government eventually prevailed. By the 1860s, a combination of government pressure, agricultural reform, and simple hunger had broken through the opposition. Within a generation, the potato had become a core staple. Rural communities gave it a name that told you everything about how they now felt about it. They called it the second bread. In China, European traders had introduced the potato during the 17th century, but it remained a curiosity for a long time. What changed it was geography. Chinese farmers in the mountainous interior provinces, Yunnan, Sichuan, Guizhou, discovered that potatoes could thrive at altitudes and in soils where rice paddies and wheat fields were impossible. The potato filled a gap that no other crop could reach. By the mid-20th century, China had become the largest potato producer on Earth. Today, the country grows over 90 million metric tons per year, more than any other nation on the planet. India followed a parallel path. British colonial officials had introduced the potato to the subcontinent in the late 18th century. Once Indian farmers adopted it at scale, production grew rapidly. Today, India is the second largest potato producer in the world, and the crop has embedded itself so thoroughly into Indian cuisine that many people are genuinely surprised to learn it is not native to the region. Across East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, adoption came later but spread quickly. Highland climates that closely resembled the Andean conditions where the potato had evolved proved exceptionally productive. The United Nations has identified the potato as one of the most important tools in the global effort against hunger and malnutrition, and multiple African nations have launched dedicated national programs to expand production and improve food security. Globally, the potato is now the fourth most important food crop on Earth, behind only wheat, rice, and corn. More than 300 million metric tons are produced every year across more than 150 countries. The scale of what happens to that crop after harvest would stun an Inca farmer. French fries, which likely originated in Belgium or France sometime in the late 18th century, are now a multi-billion-dollar global industry and arguably the most consumed cooked food on Earth. Americans alone eat roughly 50 pounds of frozen potato products per person per year. McDonald's uses more than 3 billion pounds of potatoes annually just for its fries. The potato chip, invented according to legend in 1853 by a frustrated chef in Saratoga Springs, New York, who sliced potatoes paper thin and fried them crisp to spite a difficult customer, has become its own enormous industry. The average American consumes around 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 17 pounds of chips in a year. But here is the part that tends to catch people off guard. Potato starch is used in manufacturing to produce paper, textiles, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics. Vodka, one of the most consumed spirits on Earth, has been traditionally distilled from potatoes across Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia for centuries. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists converted potato starch into synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires when natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia were cut off by Japanese forces. Potato derivatives appear in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and animal feed. The adhesive on the back of a postage stamp may contain potato starch. The potato is not just feeding the world. It is, in ways that are largely invisible, holding parts of the industrial world together. And in 1995, the potato became the first vegetable ever grown in space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin cultivated potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia as part of research into long-duration space missions. Agricultural scientists working on future lunar and Martian colonies have returned to the potato again and again for the same reasons Andean farmers refused to give up on it 8,000 years ago. It grows in poor, mineral-heavy soil. It produces more calories per acre than any grain crop. It requires relatively little water compared to rice. It stores well under harsh conditions. It provides a broad range of essential nutrients. The same qualities that made the potato indispensable in the Andes are why NASA lists it as the leading candidate for the first crop a human colony will grow on another planet. Think about that. A plant that the Spanish dismissed as food for the poor, that French legislators banned for causing leprosy, that the Russian Orthodox Church called the devil's fruit, that Scottish clergymen refused to eat because it was not mentioned in the Bible. That plant is the leading candidate for feeding the first humans who live permanently somewhere other than Earth. The arc of the potato is, in some ways, the arc of every idea that threatened the established order before the established order ran out of arguments against it. It began as a toxic weed in the Andes, transformed by farmers who spent thousands of years learning what most of the world would not bother to understand for millennia. It built an empire. It was ignored by the conquerors who dismantled that empire. It sat in European gardens as a curiosity while people went hungry around it. It took a Prussian king and a French pharmacist running elaborate confidence schemes to drag it into respectability. It fed the most vulnerable populations in Ireland when nothing else would, and when it failed with consequences that reshaped the demographic map of the entire Atlantic world. And then it kept going. It did not need rehabilitation after the famine. The science caught up to it. The world caught up to it. The numbers became undeniable. The deepest irony may be this. The lesson the Irish famine should have taught, never stake everything on a single genetic variety, is a lesson that modern global agriculture has not fully learned. Today's industrial food system depends on a handful of high-yield varieties for most of the world's major crops. The monoculture fragility that destroyed Ireland in 1845 still exists at a global scale, wrapped in different packaging. The potato survived its catastrophe. Whether industrial monoculture survives its own version of Phytophthora infestans is, as yet, unanswered. Hit subscribe if you want more food history that goes further than the familiar version, and drop a comment. Which part of this story changed how you think about something you eat every day?